In this video, we'll be going through the header module and we'll be going for the text overlay variation. The header module, as the name implies, often sits at the beginning of your website. You can use it wherever you want, but it's ideally suited for sitting at the top. You can see there's a desktop image and a mobile image. I will change the mobile image to a different image now. And as always, we should enter some appropriate alternative text, save that. And now the first thing you will see is how the mobile image shows at smaller resolutions. And at larger resolutions, we go back to the desktop image. The overlay element can be enabled or disabled. It's actually enabled at the moment, but there's no text, so there's nothing to see there. Now that I've added some text, you can see the overlay element. If I disable the overlay element, you can see that it disappears. Let's enable it again. And save. You get the usual text formatting options, but generally in the header, it's probably best to keep the text very simple, as you do not have much space to work with. You can change the desktop font color. And you can position the text anywhere you like. However, it is worth noting that on mobile, only the top and bottom positioning makes a difference. There are some intricacies to this header module that I will go through in a bit, so we'll go back to the positioning once we'll get to that section. First, let's go through a few other options, such as where the tint area is located. You can make the tint cover the entire header. If you wanted some text to have good contrast against your background, particularly on white backgrounds, you could then make it cover the entire header, or you can make it sit behind the text overlay. For the desktop width, let me use some slightly longer text. I'm intentionally breaking the character limit here in order to show off the desktop width. At the moment it's 60%, which means the header will always take up 60% of the width of the screen on desktop. Let me make this 90% now. Now you can see it's much longer, and if I make it something much smaller, you'll see the design is probably not going to fit that well anymore. So therefore it's probably recommended to keep it relatively wide on desktop, but it depends on the amount of text you have and your preferences. On mobile, you can also determine the width of the text. At the moment, we are using a square image shape header, and on the square and landscape options of that header, the text moves below the main image, which means the mobile width attribute doesn't apply, but I will explain that in a second. The side margin and top margin properties are best demonstrated by moving the overlay to the top left corner, for example, or the bottom left, top right, or bottom right corners. The side margin determines how far this element is away from the sides of the screen. So you can set this to 0, and that moves it right up to the edge. Or you can set it to 30%, for example, and that moves it far, far into the header image. Of course, at some point it's just easier to use these positioning values. So this is just for fine-tuning the positioning of the overlay element. I would generally choose reasonably low values here. Please note that the side margin is measured in percentage sizes, so that it can always adjust to the width of the screen. So on mobile devices, for example, if this was just a pixel value, you would end up with a very small or a very large gap depending on the screen you're dealing with, whereas the side margin always keeps it in the same place. The top margin is measured in pixels. At the moment it's 5 pixels, you can see that up here. I will now make it 20 pixels, and you can see the gap has grown larger. The same rules apply in the different positions of the overlay element. So it's called a top margin, but it affects the top or the bottom, and the side margin affects the sides. The overlay padding lets you determine how far the background behind the text expands outwards beyond the text. So let's change this to 5%. You'll see this is much bigger now. Change it to 1, and it's very close up against the text. We've defaulted this to 2% because we found that to be the most attractive option, but of course this is up to you. You can change the color of the tint, and you can change the tint opacity. The opacity determines, as you can imagine, how transparent the overlay background is, so you can make it basically black, or you can make it disappear. Now for the mobile image shape. This is a slightly more complicated attribute, but I think it'll make sense once I go through the different options. Right now we have selected square. Square means that when you're on a mobile device, the aspect ratio of this image will always be square. You can see this is a square image. And you can see the copy for your header has moved below the main image. On landscape, you will notice that this is now a landscape image rather than a square image, and again, your overlay text is below the header. Going to portrait, things change a little bit. Now the text stays on the main image of the header, and now the positioning of this text can change again. But as you will notice, this left and right positioning now only affects whether the header text is at the top or at the bottom. When going back to desktop, you will see it's now in the upper right corner. Lastly, we have a chevron option. You can either show the chevron or make it disappear. Here is the chevron. And one piece of functionality that is also quite useful to show off is that the chevron will scroll to the next module. So I'll add 2 text and image modules quickly. And now you can see that when clicking the chevron, the website automatically scrolls down. You can also control the chevron colors. And that's the header text overlay module.